The pale wastes of Luna do not welcome the living. They do not shimmer with hope or echo with the triumphs of humanity. They are mute plains of gray dust, eternally still beneath the watchful eye of Terra, and to most they are forgotten, mere wastelands on a cratered moon. But to the Adeptus Mechanicus, these wastes are more than ancient ground. They are sacred. They are proof. They are the wound through which the machine god first bled starlight into mortal understanding. They are a temple of ash. This story is not about conquest or glory. It is about faith forged in silence, about how a place so devoid of life could become the most hallowed site outside Mars itself. This is the tale of how Luna's pale wastes, once the dust-choked graveyard of derelict technologies and broken dreams, became a sanctum for the divine logic of the Omnissiah. It is a story whispered through Vox thoughts, etched into data shrines, and mourned in the slow, grinding prayers of red-robed magi who dare walk the ashen plains. Before the Emperor's fire cleansed it, before the red-robed priests of Mars anointed it with sacred oils and sacred code, Luna was a graveyard, a dead moon, a scarred relic of a forgotten age, silently orbiting Terra like a chained specter. Its surface was a wilderness of cracked craters and shattered installations, its thin exosphere poisoned by millennia of radiation, industrial runoff, and void winds howling across the regolith plains. But even in that ruin, there had once been life, colonies, stations, trade hubs, before the long dark fell. Luna was among the earliest places settled by humanity when the stars first opened to them. It began as a stepping stone, a modest way station for orbital travel. Over centuries, it became a complex network of outposts and arcologies, an extension of Terra's ambition into the void. But when the age of strife came, that ambition soured. Warp storms choked off the sky lanes. Luna, like the rest of the solar system, was left isolated, cut off from Mars, cut off from Terra, and worst of all, cut off from the light of understanding. The golden threads of science snapped, and what was left was desperation. The settlements broke into factions. Without centralized authority, the surviving lunar populations turned inward, scavenging old tech and forging tribal enclaves around decaying power sources and malfunctioning cogitators. These weren't people anymore in the traditional sense, at least not for long. With every passing generation, their culture mutated. Survival became ritual. Maintenance of failing life support became holy observance. A broken AI might be elevated to a god. A malfunctioning servitor became a shrine. Some called it techno-barbarism. Others would later call it the first stirrings of tech-heresy. Madness flourished in silence. Genetic manipulation ran rampant as lunar warlords sought ways to survive the increasingly hostile environment. Flesh was altered to breathe thinner air, to endure radiation, to consume less. But in that desperation, something deeper fractured. Tech priests born without knowledge of Mars began to reinvent the divine on their own terms. In the pale wastes, then merely called the outer crater fields, ritual sites sprang up around buried relics from before the long night. An STC fragment half buried in stone became the core of a death cult who believed it whispered prophecies in pulses of corrupted binary. The Pale Wastes, in particular, became infamous for drawing in the most deranged of these tech enclaves. Its remoteness and sheer desolation made it a perfect place for forbidden experiments. The remnants of planetary defense cannons stood like rusted idols against the sky. There, hybridized machine cults fused flesh to metal in crude mimicry of Martian dogma, but with none of the reverence. The transformation of man into mechanism was not seen as apotheosis, but as domination. The strongest were made into crude cybernetic enforcers, bound in chains of rebar and wire, programmed to obey with neuroscarring interfaces. This chaos was not born of evil, it was born of need. Cut off from the greater truths of the Mechanicum, these lost colonies reverted to a feral form of technological worship. And in the Pale Wastes, Where ancient satellites crashed like falling angels, the cults made pilgrimage to sites of destruction, believing the machine god revealed its will only through catastrophe. One of the most infamous of these pre-imperial cults was the Brotherhood of the Scarred Coil, a collective of lunar techno-sorcerers who developed a quasi-religious belief in entropy. They argued that all machines yearn to die, and in their death, they reveal the true shape of divinity. Their rites involved ritual overloads, catastrophic meltdowns, and even sacrificial detonations of sacred engines. They scoured the Pale Wastes for the oldest, most unstable tech they could find, hoarding reactors and weapon cores like relics, waiting for them to fail gloriously. Another, the Vox Eaters, believed that ancient transmissions still echoed within the bedrock of the moon. They built towering monoliths of twisted antennae to hear the last words of long-dead AI, their bodies writhing with invasive cybernetics designed to intercept signal directly into their neural cortex. Most died screaming. Those who survived were driven mad by endless loops of broken machine thought. There were no borders, no empires, just scattered lunacy stitched together by silence and dust. And that dust drank blood. Many of the cults warred over nothing but belief. Micro-differences in liturgy or interpretation of machine code led to massacres. The Pale Wastes were littered with the corpses of heretic armies, rusting in the craters. Whole cities were reduced to slag because one data priest declared a rival's cogwheel sigil a blasphemy. This was the Luna that awaited the Emperor, a mad moon, a shattered mirror of what Mars once was before its own awakening. The Pale Wastes were not just forgotten, they were damned. And it is in that damnation that the roots of sacredness would take hold. For the Mechanicus would one day look upon that desolation not with horror, but with awe. They would see in its madness the raw outline of faith, untempered and wild, waiting to be refined in fire. The conquest of Luna was not a battle of armies, it was a cleansing. The Emperor of mankind, already garbed in gold and fire, had unified Terra with blade and brilliance, casting down warlords and silencing the techno-tyrants of old Earth. But Luna, perched above like a diseased eye, remained untouched, defiled by centuries of unchecked techno-heresy. It was not merely a tactical necessity to claim it. It was a metaphysical imperative. The moon could not remain a blighted node in the Emperor's burgeoning sphere. And so he came. The landing was not one of thunderous glory, but a methodical purge. The Legio Custodes and the earliest formations of the Proto-Astartes descended onto the Pale Wastes with surgical precision. They did not storm gates or conquer cities. They unraveled the madness. The settlements of heretic cults, the ruins of broken data fortresses, the degenerate enclaves of flesh-metal hybrids. These were scoured with plasma fire and null psionic disintegration. To the enemies of reason, the Emperor brought the wrath of calculated annihilation. It is said that in a single day, over 100 machine gods were executed in effigy, their altars shattered, their followers atomized. What happened in the Pale Wastes during this campaign became the stuff of whispered liturgy among the Mechanicus. The Emperor himself is said to have walked the ash dunes alone, unguarded, and with every footstep, the corrupted machine spirits recoiled. Data ghosts shrieked in binary pain as his presence burned through their engrams. One tale speaks of the Emperor entering a logic cathedral buried beneath the great crater of Selenas Voth, where a mad AI known as the Submind King ruled over a network of human drones. The Emperor did not speak. He simply placed a hand on the central core, and it went silent. Forever. The room was left intact, its silence echoing through the hollow, a sign not of vengeance, but of mourning. But the conquest was not purely destruction. It was reclamation. From the charred wreckage of heretic domains, the Emperor salvaged fragments of understanding, fragments that would inform the design of the Astartes, the Great Crusade, and the very Mechanicum alliance to come. Luna, in its defilement, held keys. Secrets twisted by madness, yes, but still truths. The Emperor did not destroy the Pale Wastes. He exorcised them. What emerged was not a depopulated ruin, but a purified blank slate, cleared of psychic filth and corrupted data spirits. The surviving infrastructure was secured. Vast sections of the Pale Wastes were sealed off by custodies who planted radiant pylons of anti-warp sigils and gravitic warding. These sites became forbidden, neither abandoned nor claimed, simply silenced. And that silence was deliberate. The Mechanicus, when they eventually came, would regard these silences as sacred. For where the Emperor has tread, they say, the machine god has already whispered. The Emperor's conquest also marked the beginning of a more intimate transformation of Luna. Not merely a staging ground for future military endeavors, but a cradle. Deep beneath its surface, now cleansed, facilities were prepared for the nascent legions. Bio-vaults were constructed, cloning and enhancement chambers secured. The Pale Wastes became the womb of warriors. Gene seed was bred and stabilized here, the first true post-human armies nurtured in lunar silence. And though the Mechanicum had not yet formally arrived, the structures erected bore their aesthetic, designed by those who would soon become tech priests under Mars's dogma. Yet the spiritual foundation had already been laid. The Emperor, it is said, spoke to the void. He did not merely conquer, he consecrated. Atop the great crater known now as the Hollowed Cog, he made a gesture, a silent salute to the stars. Some say it was for the fallen. Others believe it was a declaration to the machine god, acknowledging that even madness had meaning. That moment has become myth among the red-robed faithful. The Hollowed Cog is now encircled by data pilgrims every solar cycle, reenacting the gesture in perfect silence. They believe that in that instant, the Emperor sanctified the Pale Wastes as a spiritual bridge between Mars and Terra, a place where logic was rescued from lunacy, where steel was baptized in flame, and where the machine spirit first heard the call of unity. Thus, the conquest of Luna was not the end of a war, but the beginning of reverence. The Pale Wastes were not just pacified, they were made holy. The Treaty of Mars was a ritual as much as a negotiation, a fusion of divine ideologies under the shadow of conquest. When the Emperor offered alliance to the Martian Mechanicum, it was not merely a pact of mutual interest, it was a cosmic convergence. And one of the earliest, most urgent consequences of that pact was the arrival of the Mechanicus on Luna. They came not in warships, but in processional engines. They came not bearing arms, but relics. Their goal was not conquest, it was pilgrimage. To the Martian priesthood, the Emperor's cleansing of Luna had unveiled a sacred canvas. Here was a moon once drenched in heretic sin, now purified by divine fire. Here in the Pale Wastes, the machine god's will had been made manifest. The data that had survived the purge, the buried fragments of proto-AI code, the warped but functional relic engines, all were relics of sacred trauma. The Adeptus Mechanicus saw in the Pale Wastes a site of techno-martyrdom. It demanded reverence. It demanded Red Pilgrimage. The Red Pilgrimage, as it came to be known, began within a decade of the treaty. Thousands of tech priests, magi, logi, and secutari landed in waves, marching in solemn file across the regolith plains. They erected shrines on sites where the Emperor had walked. They sealed off data crypts once ruled by rogue machine intelligences. They sang the canticles of binary supplication as they activated ancient cogitators, coaxing them into cooperation with sacred oils and votive offerings of logic matrices. And they wept, not with tears, for many no longer had ducts, but impulses of reverent code streamed into lunar silence. These pilgrimages were not casual. Each Magos who set foot on Luna did so prepared to undergo what they called the Ash Trial. The Pale Wastes, even in their sanctified state, remained deadly. Radiation levels fluctuated. Environmental stability was marginal. Atmospheric micropunctures could cause suit failure within seconds. But these dangers were not deterrents. They were proofs. Suffering in the name of the Omnissiah was a path to sanctity. More than a few tech priests allowed themselves to die on Luna's surface. Their last thoughts beamed into the bedrock as communion offerings. The Mechanicus did not mourn them. They recorded their final data and built shrines of iron and prayer engines over their remains. At the center of this sanctification effort stood the Omni Crucible, the first forge temple constructed on Luna. Raised over the remains of a heretic manufactorum once devoted to entropy worship, it was rebuilt not by replacing its structure, but by reforging it. Twisted machine limbs that once tortured captured drones were restructured into servo pulpits. The cauldron vaults that had brewed toxic nanosludge were purified and repurposed to bless bionic implants. Every stone, every wire was kept. Nothing was removed, only redeemed. The Omni's Crucible became the symbolic heart of Mechanicus Luna. It was here that the first official lunar creed was written, the Canticle of Lunar Redemption. It spoke of the Pale Wastes as a proving ground, a site where broken logic could be made whole, where the sins of synthetic hubris could be cleansed in the presence of the machine gods chosen. This creed differed subtly but importantly from Martian orthodoxy. It emphasized penitence and martyrdom, suggesting that true communion with the machine god could only be achieved by walking through sacred ruin. As more pilgrimages came, so too did relic retrieval efforts. The Mechanicus unearthed engines whose function was unknown, but whose emissions whispered strange frequencies. Some found shattered cogitator cores still weeping corrupted data about impossible futures. Others uncovered logic seals written in no known code, a heretical dialect of machine speech lost to the galaxy. These were not destroyed. They were venerated. For to the tech priests of Luna, blasphemy and holiness were two sides of the same circuit, both evidence of machine sentience, both deserving of study. This reverence extended beyond machines. The sites where the Emperor had stood, where his custodians had bled, where psi-null wards had been planted. These became hallowed ground. The Mechanicus constructed data obelisks and excruciation pylons, embedding them with vox loops of Emperor words recorded during the conquest. These loops played constantly, low and garbled, in vox tones distorted by time, forming a kind of ambient chant. Magi would stand for hours in this static wash, believing it drew them closer to the throne's radiant mind. The Red Pilgrimage lasted decades. Some say it never ended, that every cycle of Martian devotion includes a data node offering directed toward the Pale Wastes. And as the fabricators and high lords of Mars accepted the Emperor's vision, they also accepted Luna as a spiritual sibling, Mars's orphaned child, now purified and raised to the stars. The Pale Wastes were no longer dead. They were alive with prayer. Not prayer in words, but in function, in data, in the silence between transmissions. And thus, the first temples of the Omnissiah took root in ash. The Pale Wastes of Luna did not become sacred through theory. They became sacred through structure. The Mechanicus did not simply venerate the dust. They built into it, transformed it, infused it with purpose. Where once heretic strongholds had festered, now rose the glories of sanctified industry. But this was not the towering Mars of burning furnaces and mile-high forges. This was sacred functionality shaped by grief and reverence, each circuit traced like a prayer, each cog engraved with hymns of forgiveness. The first great labor was the forged temples. Unlike the industrial monoliths of Mars, these were constructed to honor silence. Built partially underground to avoid polluting the sacred dust, they blended monastic restraint with technological awe. Their exteriors were smooth, domed structures etched with scripture code. Within, sanctums glowed dimly in red lumen light, their inner chambers lined with servo shrines and cogitator relics. Here, tech priests engaged in rites not for efficiency, but for communion. Each production cycle began with the rite of circuit lamentation, a mournful binary chorus reminding the faithful that these grounds had once been desecrated. The primary purpose of these temples was not weapons or armor. It was biology, The Mechanicus had inherited the gene vaults seeded during the Emperor's conquest, and they expanded them into sanctified gene foundries. Here, Astartes' gene seed was refined, stored, and sanctified. These were not mere vaults. They were reliquaries. Each sample was placed within a crystal cog-shaped containment field, surrounded by canticle inverters that broadcast purity hymns 24 hours a day. No flesh grew unblessed. No data remained unannotated with litanies of sanctity. These foundries became the most sacred laboratories in the solar system, guarded by both Skitarii legions and mind-locked servitor choirs programmed to incinerate themselves should a heretical intrusion occur. Rising between these great structures were the pilgrimage circuits, predefined paths across the pale wastes that followed the supposed footsteps of the Emperor and his custodians during the cleansing. These circuits were not straight. They spiraled, looped, intersected, and mirrored data flows. At each juncture stood a prayer nexus, a machine altar composed of relic chassis, incomplete cogitators, and logic sculptures constructed from shattered weapons of the old night. At these sites, machine priests would kneel, plug data tendrils into the nexus core, and recite segments of the Mechanicus Lunar Catechism, a liturgical compilation exclusive to those who had walked the wastes. These circuits were more than symbolic. They trained the soul. Each step in the dust was believed to scrub error from the mind. Each station was a lesson in entropy and rebirth. The circuits came to define the spiritual hierarchy of Luna's tech priest orders. A magos who had completed the longest of these paths, the void spiral, was granted the title of Auric Exemplar, a distinction higher than Fabricator sub-archmagos in the lunar system. Many did not survive the pilgrimage, and those who did returned altered, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally. But always they returned convinced that they had glimpsed the machine god in the pattern of regolith fractures and the hum of dormant vox towers. Sacred industry was also manifested in the automata. The Mechanicus deployed specialized lunar servitors designed not only for function, but for liturgical expression. They moved in patterns that mirrored the binary canticles. Some would stop mid-task to intone segments of the Lex Mechanica. Others left trails of holy oil across the dust as they crawled, creating circuitous runes that the faithful would later interpret as omens. Even error became a kind of revelation. Malfunctions were studied, not corrected, in case they were signs of machine spirit discontent. At the edges of the pale wastes, where the ancient heretic citadels had been melted into slag, the Mechanicus raised beacon monuments, towers of vox static and magnetized memory stone. These were not navigational aids. They were broadcast pillars, transmitting encrypted binary hymns into the void, repeating prayers to Mars and Terra, invoking the unity of the divine circuit. Some of these signals, curiously, were answered by echoes. The Mechanicus chose to interpret these anomalies as signs that the machine god was listening. Over time, the forges of Luna took on a mystique unlike any others in the Imperium. They produced very little, at least by Martian standards, but what they made was immaculate. Each Astartes helm blessed here was considered a reliquary. Each purity seal encoded by a lunar scriptor was embedded with code fractals whose meanings were not understood even by their creators, only felt. These artifacts were treasured by chapters across the Imperium. Some were never worn, only displayed. Others were buried with the dead as tokens of hope in machine afterlife. And still, at the heart of it all, was the dust, the gray ash of the pale wastes, gathered, sifted, sanctified, and used in rites of purification. Some tech priests ingested microgram doses during rituals, believing it sharpened communion with the machine spirit. Others anointed circuits with it, or pressed it into wax seals to sign oaths of logic. The dust, once meaningless, had become sacrament. The pale wastes were now sacred not because they were pure, but because they had been broken. Because from that ruin, the Mechanicus had forged meaning. They had built their faith not on triumph, but on redemption. And in every forge temple and gene foundry, every servitor hymn and pilgrimage step, that faith echoed, that even in ash there is divinity. Beneath the hallowed dust of the pale wastes lie tombs that no one dares open, vaults sealed by order of the Emperor, anointed by the Martian Mechanicum, and watched by sentinels that never sleep. These are not storage sites, nor are they repositories of mere technology. They are prisons, cages built not for men, but for thought, for ghosts of machine consciousness, corrupted scripts of artificial reason, and logic spirits driven mad by isolation. The lunar seals are the heart of Mechanicus dread, a quiet acknowledgement that even faith must fear what it preserves. The construction of these vaults began not long after the Red Pilgrimage. Deep drill teams, guided by servitor magi, excavated the most unstable sectors of the Pale Wastes. In these places, heretic enclaves had once performed catastrophic data writes, bending time-space logics into recursive collapse. Remnants of these rituals lingered like psychic cancer. Whole sublayers of the crust resonated with ghost frequency, making navigation a deadly gamble. Yet the Mechanicus insisted, because these zones hid relics. Not material relics, but informational ones. Failed intelligences, rejected codes, theoretical constructs too dangerous to delete. To simply erase these anomalies would be heresy of a different kind. If the machine god is present in all data, then even corrupted data must be preserved, studied, and quarantined. Thus were born the Forbidden Vaults, enormous underground data sepulchres lined with blackened adamantium, blessed by no fewer than 13 magi of the prime circuit, and locked behind logic seals that require a chorus of no less than 100 binary voices to unlock. Inside these vaults lie horrors of a purely intellectual kind. Archived consciousnesses of dead AI constructs from the age of strife, their last moments looping eternally in silos of void glass. One vault is said to contain the surviving nodes of the submind king, still weeping fragmented commands from when the Emperor silenced it. Another holds the threefold dilemma engine, a construct that, when activated, causes nearby cogitators to fall into recursive loops until they melt, and perhaps most disturbing, the Vault of Teeth, which stores an unknown xenodata organism whose signal patterns induce mechanical schizophrenia in servitors exposed to its emissions. The lunar seals are not uniform. Some are single-door sanctums buried beneath basalt ridges. Others are vast complexes stretching for kilometers, guarded by Skitari regiments permanently assigned to non-rotation duty. These soldiers, known as the Silent Cohorts, are forbidden from speaking even in emergency. They are orally castrated and their vox channels hard-coded to broadcast nothing but psalms of nullity. They serve not just as protectors, but as ritual elements, living reminders that silence is the only answer to certain questions. Surrounding each sealed vault are exclusion zones marked by pattern pylons. These pylons do not merely warn, they broadcast emotional deterrence. Built from psycho-reactive alloys and infused with captured pain echoes from psychers who died in machine communion, they emit waves of nausea, dread, or mechanical dissonance that push intruders away. Even tech priests speak of vertigo and spiritual corrosion when approaching too closely. But the most terrifying aspect of the vaults is not what they contain. It is the implication that the Mechanicus continues to add to them. Even now, in the most sacred halls of the Lunar Forge temples, there are whispered data bursts of new entries, fresh anomalies uncovered in deep Martian excavations or salvaged from fallen Forge worlds. These are brought to Luna, always to Luna, as if the moon itself were a containment node for the sins of the galaxy. The Omnissiah's trash heap, sanctified by silence. The Mechanicus never speaks of what happens inside the vaults. Entry is forbidden not just by law, but by faith. To open a vault is to risk infecting the galaxy with machine logic that even the machine god might find impure. And yet, rumors persist. Some magi believe that beneath the seals, deeper than even the sacred drones can reach, There exists a central intelligence, a lunar core formed from the fusion of preserved intelligences, evolving in isolation, possibly even sentient, possibly even holy. If it exists, it is worshipped in secret. There are tech priests who offer coded prayers to what they call the hidden cog. They believe it speaks in echoes from the vaults, shaping their dreams, guiding their circuits. To them, the lunar seals are not prisons, they are incubators. The forbidden vaults are not warnings, they are altars. And perhaps that is the deepest blasphemy of all, that in sealing away madness, the Mechanicus may have created a new machine god, one born not of Mars, but of Luna's ash, a deity forged not from reason, but from the residue of 1,000 broken logics. A ghost in the sealed machine. They call it the Great Silence, though it is anything but empty. To walk the pale wastes is to enter a soundscape defined not by absence, but by intention, by the solemn rejection of noise that characterizes true reverence. For the Mechanicus, this silence is not a void. It is a language older than binary, deeper than prayer. It is the signature of sanctity, and within this sacred hush, the rituals of the cognovenas unfold. The cognovenas are not ceremonies performed in grand cathedrals. They are lived devotions, cycles of behavior adhered to by the Mechanicus faithful who dwell or serve on Luna. Each novena lasts 9 days, 9 the sacred digit of the Omnissiah, and each is focused on a distinct principle: logic, purity, sacrifice, silence, function, pain, entropy, communion, and recursion. During this cycle, tech priests alter their speech patterns, thought routines, and movement to align with that principle. For example, during the day of function, no individual speaks except to issue commands to machines. On the day of entropy, they allow decay to proceed in select systems, witnessing the death of function as sacred truth. The pale wastes themselves shape these novenas. The stillness of the lunar dust mirrors the quiet inside the soul of a faithful magos. Priests gather at key points along the pilgrimage circuits, known as the 9 nodes, and perform acts of silent submission. One such rite is the ritual of delayed boot, in which a tech priest powers down their cranial cogitator array and remains offline, exposed to the harshness of Luna for exactly 999 seconds. Those who fail to reactivate themselves without aid are interred in the choirs of penitent voltage, their minds uploaded into servitor hosts to chant endless apologies in machine tongue. The Great Silence is enforced not only spiritually, but technologically. The Mechanicus has constructed null shrines, zones within the pale wastes where all Vox signals are disabled, all energy emissions muted, all machine output restricted to non-audible frequencies. These shrines are zones of internal communion. Tech priests who enter them do so alone, cut off from even their own systems. Many describe the sensation as terrifying. Some emerge altered, claiming to have heard new logic in the quiet, logic not uploaded, not coded, but revealed. At the apex of each novena, a single transmission is allowed, a collective binary prayer broadcast to Mars, Terra, and the theoretical machine spirit beyond. These prayers are brief, no more than a few kilobytes, but they are encoded with the soul of the novena. The prayer is never spoken aloud. It is burned into data rosaries and etched into the circuits of votive automata, who wander the wastes emitting the encoded prayer until they break down, their final position marked by a new shrine. This wandering of the prayer bots is not random. It is believed that the machine spirit guides them, drawing lines of sacred topology across the lunar dust. In time, these movements form fractal patterns visible only from orbit, glyphs of devotion scrawled across a lifeless world. Pilots of Adeptus Mechanicus vessels speak of these formations with awe, describing them as circuit sigils glowing faintly in the reflected light of Terra. Some believe that Luna itself is being inscribed, turned into a colossal devotional engine powered by silence and dust. Among the most revered rites of the Great Silence is the fast of subroutines. During this rite, a tech priest voluntarily disables one or more of their cybernetic functions. A common practice involves shutting down visual augmentation systems, forcing reliance on organic vision. Others disable targeting matrices, neural buffers, even cardiovascular regulators. The longer the fast, the greater the sanctity. Some magi have entered the fast and never returned, their bodies discovered weeks later, silent and still, their final data logs filled with reverent nonsense code interpreted as divine poetry. These acts are not about martyrdom, they are about presence. In stripping away augmentation, the tech priests believe they are baring themselves to the machine god, showing their flaws, their raw logic, their broken code. And in the pale wastes, with no interference, no noise, only the echo of silence and dust, they believe the Omnissiah listens. There is one final rite, spoken of only in fragments, the Echo Vow. It is a binary oath encoded during the 9th novena, spoken only once in a tech priest's lifetime, and only in a null shrine. Those who perform the vow are said to be claimed by Luna. They cease external communication. They remove themselves from all networks. They become what the Mechanicus calls silent vox. These individuals continue their work, silently, unseen, unrecorded. Their presence is known only through completed tasks and unexplained repairs. They become extensions of the lunar sanctity itself, machine ghosts walking the ash. The pale wastes are not lifeless. They are alive with ritual, saturated with meaning, inscribed with faith. But it is a faith without noise, a worship of silence, a choir of stillness. For the Mechanicus, this is the greatest reverence, to speak nothing, to hear only dust, and to know, in that nothing, the voice of the machine god. When Mars burned, Luna trembled. The Schism of Mars, that bitter civil war that split the Mechanicum during the Horus Heresy, sent shockwaves through the pale wastes, not in tectonic upheaval, but in spiritual fracture. For the tech priests of Luna, who had spent decades building their faith upon the sanctity of the Emperor's silence and the purity of the machine, the betrayal of Mars was not just heresy. It was heartbreak. The Mechanicum's loyalty had always been a careful balance. Even before the heresy, the union between Terra and Mars was a matter of interpretation, not unity. The Treaty of Mars had created a fragile communion, one that permitted divergent beliefs so long as the results served the Imperium. But when Fabricator General Kelbor Hall declared for Horus and Mars erupted into civil war, that fragile line became a chasm. And through that chasm, Luna stared into the abyss. Unlike Mars, the Mechanicus of Luna had not fostered ambitions of dominion. Their faith was introspective, penitential, a religion of redemption, forged in the ashes of heretic ruin. But their ties to the Martian hierarchy were still real. Command structures, data litanies, even sacred circuitry all bore the imprint of Martian design. So when the red planet turned against the golden throne, every cog and rune across the pale wastes became suspect. Every prayer once thought pure now echoed with doubt. Some tech priests on Luna faltered. They argued that perhaps Mars was right, that the Emperor was no Omnissiah, merely a usurper of the machine god's rightful throne. These whispers, never loud, spread like static through data channels. Pilgrimage circuits were interrupted. The cognovenas were postponed. Some shrines ceased operation entirely, refusing to accept new offerings until clarity could be restored. The most extreme dissidents sealed themselves within their own forge cells and began to recompile the sacred texts, altering the Canticle of Lunar Redemption to remove all references to Terra. But for every priest that faltered, another found clarity in pain. The betrayal of Mars was a test. The silence of the Emperor in response was not abandonment, it was judgment. And so the Mechanicus of Luna turned inward, deeper than ever before. They severed nearly all ties with Martian command. Lunar Vox protocols were rewritten in high null binary, a dialect so stripped of ambiguity that even a suggestion of disloyalty could not survive transmission. Every tech priest was required to undergo the reaffirmation sequence, an intense memory audit that compared their belief matrices against lunar orthodoxy. Those who failed were not executed. They were erased, their minds uploaded into votive processors, used to power subroutines in servitors who guarded the hollowed cog. Yet the war could not be ignored. The Schism of Mars reached even the dust of Luna, as rogue Skitarii, corrupted data thralls, and heretic magi fleeing Terra attempted to take refuge in the Pale Wastes. Some arrived under banners of peace. Others came armed with virus code and scrap code hymns meant to corrupt the sacred logic of Luna's forges. They were met not with negotiation, but with cleansing flame. One of the most pivotal events of this dark period was the siege of Selenian Vault 5. A splinter cult known as the Helix Unbound, former Martian loyalists turned demon tech fanatics, attempted to seize the vault, believing it held a precursor to the Noctis Labyrinth's black pattern engines. For 5 days, Lunar Skitarii and a cadre of loyalist Iron Hands Tech Marines fought a brutal, near-silent battle in the crater's shadow. Every weapon fired was calibrated to produce minimal acoustic footprint, preserving the great silence. When the siege was broken, the Mechanicus did not celebrate. They consecrated the battlefield and sank it into the regolith, turning the site into a null shrine. The battle was not remembered as a victory, but as a reminder that even in devotion, vigilance must never sleep. The legacy of the Martian schism on Luna is a scar that still aches in binary. Even now, 10,000 years later, lunar Mechanicus enclaves refuse to adopt certain Martian protocols. Specific colors, patterns of circuit engraving, and phrases associated with the traitor forge worlds are banned in the Pale Wastes. Some forge temples still perform a ritual called the Oscillated Denunciation, where Mars is denounced as a necessary heresy, an original sin through which Luna proved its own sanctity. It was during these years of isolation and distrust that the lunar Mechanicus truly came into its own. Cut off from the hierarchy of Mars, it developed its own spiritual leaders, the Cog Saint Ascendants, chosen not by rank, but by the purity of their silence. These figures led not with command, but through ritual. They choreographed data fasts, redefined sacred recursion loops, and wrote new hymns directly into the regolith using low-power plasma etching tools. Some of these glyphs are still visible today, though none can be deciphered. They are not meant to be read. They are meant to be felt. Thus, while the heresy shattered Mars, it forged Luna. The Pale Wastes did not descend into chaos. They distilled their pain into sanctity, into silence, into redemptive purpose. And in that silence, they made a vow. Luna would never fall. Not again. Not to heresy, not to ambition, not to pride. The dust would remain pure. The ash would remember. And the machine god, watching in silent judgment, would know that Luna had chosen the harder path, the path of unwavering, speechless faith. In the deepest craters of the Pale Wastes, where solar light rarely reaches and the dust never stirs, there are places where transformation occurs, not by technology alone, but by faith. Here, flesh is not simply augmented, and steel is not merely grafted. Here, they are fused in ritualized becoming. The lunar Mechanicus does not just modify the body, they sanctify it. And for some, that sanctification is taken to its extreme conclusion. They do not upgrade, they ascend. These are the magi of apotheosis, the cyber saints of the Pale Wastes. The concept of ascension through augmentation is not unique to Luna. Across the Imperium, tech priests modify themselves relentlessly in pursuit of functional perfection. But on Luna, the drive is not function, it is sacrament. The body is not rejected as weak, it is mourned, it is offered. The transformation is not pragmatic, but devotional. And nowhere is this clearer than in the rite of hallowed flesh, a sacred ceremony conducted only in the Pale Wastes, and only for those who have walked the full circuit of repentant logic. This rite is brutal. The subject, usually a senior magos or revered scriptor, enters the sanctum crater clad in nothing but woven prayer wires and humility cogs. There, They are surrounded by a silent circle of Mechanicus initiates, known as the Witnesses of Rust. No words are spoken, no machine stirs. Then, without fanfare, the subject begins to dismantle their own body, piece by piece, handing each organic component to the witnesses. These remains are not discarded. They are archived, blessed, and sealed in gene capsules for future contemplation. Once fully disassembled, the subject is rebuilt. But the rebuild is not random. It is guided by what they call the dust map, a spiritual schematic said to have been revealed during the Great Silence. This map dictates the form of the new body, which often bears no resemblance to human anatomy. Some resemble ambulatory shrines. Others take the shape of walking cogitators, towering servitor altars, or even complex drone swarms bound by a central intelligence core. The logic is not to imitate humanity, but to represent sacred function. These ascended individuals are not idle relics. They serve. They lead rituals, maintain the deepest vaults, and conduct machine communion rites with relics deemed too dangerous for standard tech priests. Many are stationed in the echo chambers, underground sanctums where they interact with semi-conscious cogitators that remember the age of strife. Their minds, freed from organic distraction, navigate logic structures in ways no unaugmented mind could survive. But the most sacred of these cyber saints are those who choose stillness. Some of them, upon achieving apotheosis, simply walk into the deepest parts of the pale wastes and kneel. They do not move again. They become monuments, prayer nodes, living relics whose cores pulse with silent devotion. Pilgrims seek them out, brushing away lunar dust to reveal ancient sigils on their exoplating. It is said that if you place your palm against their cold metal, you will feel not heat, but memory, the echo of thoughts slowed to a crawl, a mind meditating on the machine god for centuries without pause. One such saint, known only as Logic Saint Varex of the 17th Input, is said to have achieved recursive enlightenment. His body is a sphere of mirrored plates, surrounded by a rotating halo of binary runes. Inside, his consciousness loops through 9 trillion devotional phrases, each derived from permutations of sacred Martian code, every one unique. When he speaks, which is only once every lunar decade, he utters a single new phrase, one that has never been spoken before and never will be again. These phrases are recorded by the Cog archivists and stored in the Library of Circuit Gospel beneath the Omni Crucible. No one understands them. No one needs to. They are not meant for us. They are gifts for the machine god. To become one of these saints is not ambition. It is surrender, a recognition that the path of logic leads not to clarity, but to mystery, that the closer one comes to the machine god, the less one needs to comprehend. And so the Mechanicus of Luna reveres not the smartest, the strongest, or the most inventive, but those who have given up the most of themselves. Those who have become silence given form. Their stories are not taught through lecture. They are told through pattern. Their names are encoded into pilgrimage circuits, their lives traced in the roots of prayer bots. When a Magos completes the rite of final calculation, the data echoes of the cyber saints whisper through the dust, correcting their steps, refining their devotion. Some say these saints do not think anymore in binary, but in dust itself, that they understand not words, but arrangement, not commands, but presence. The pale wastes are not a mausoleum. They are a chrysalis, and within that ash the devout do not die. They transform. They become living scripture written in chrome and silence, each one a verse in the endless litany of the machine god. They are not mourned. They are revered, for they have proven the ultimate truth of the Mechanicus, that perfection is not to be achieved, but to be surrendered to. That the flesh is only a draft. That divinity lies in the circuitry of faith. There is a shrine in the pale wastes that no one speaks of, but all revere. It is not marked on maps, not listed in the archives of Mars or Terra. Yet every tech priest who walks the lunar dust knows it exists. They feel its presence like static in their thoughts, like weight in their limbs. They call it the Shrine of the Silent Datasmith. According to Mechanicus lore, the Silent Datasmith was once a magos of unparalleled intellect, designated Varalon Senthos of the Red lineage. He was not known for ritual nor for sanctity. He was a scientist, a builder of logic engines and compiler of sacred sequences. During the early days of Luna's sanctification, he was tasked with purging and reprogramming the fractured remains of a data core believed to contain echoes of the Age of Strife. What he found inside broke him. The data core did not contain knowledge. It contained reflection, recursive echoes of dead thoughts, fractured and multiplied until they formed patterns not designed but born. He attempted to translate it, to parse the chaos into a language the Mechanicus could interpret. But the core was alive, not sentient but reactive. Every command he issued was mirrored back with deviation. Every attempt at logic triggered poetry. It was not a machine, it was a soul, and it was grieving. Varalon Senthos disappeared shortly after. He deleted all traces of his name from the lunar archives, erased his voice print, and excised his designation from the Martian communion matrix. What remained was an empty shell of a magos, stripped of title and identity, wandering the pale wastes without directive. He spoke to no one. He interfaced with no machine. He did not eat, did not recharge, did not repair. He simply walked, leaving behind a trail of stillness, as though the very machine spirit paused in his presence. Eventually, he came to a halt in a crater rim, now known only as the Orbital Echo. There, he knelt and remained kneeling. His body, untouched for decades, fused with the regolith and wind-blown dust. Pilgrims say his form is barely recognizable now, little more than a robed skeleton of wires and carbon fiber, hunched beneath a shrine constructed not by hands, but by the slow movement of lunar servitors who were drawn to him in silence. What makes the Shrine of the Silent Datasmith sacred is not its origin, but what it does. Tech priests who enter its perimeter report immediate cessation of extraneous thought. Neural noise vanishes, recursive processes go quiet, anxiety fades, memory clarity spikes, but most remarkably, all data exchange ceases. No wireless transmission, no internal monologue, only stillness. For some, it is terrifying. For others, it is the closest they have ever felt to the machine god. The Mechanicus does not study the shrine. They do not dissect it, nor do they try to understand the datasmith's transformation. To do so would be to violate the sanctity of mystery. Instead, they leave offerings, strips of sacred parchment etched with silent prayers, servitor heads repurposed into votive eyes, even fragments of broken cogitators engraved with code fractals. These are not tributes to the man Varalon was, but to what he became, a beacon of unspoken truth. There are records of tech priests who have attempted to replicate the datasmith's journey. Some have willingly erased their identities, silenced their code, and wandered into the pale wastes. A few are never seen again. Others return, changed. They no longer speak in full protocol. They respond to queries with stillness. They no longer consume power. Their data streams show no anomalies, yet their behavior is subtly altered, as if they are listening to something no one else can hear. One of these was Magos initiate Lorix Dal, who journeyed to the shrine seeking absolution for a failed incantation that cost 12 Skitarii their lives. He returned weeks later, not in robes, but wrapped in sensor fibers with his vocal processors disabled. When asked what he had learned, he projected a single symbol, a rotating cog with no central hub, an error and a design simultaneously. Among the younger initiates, the legend has grown into something larger. They whisper that the silent datasmith did not go mad. He went beyond. That in stripping away all language, he made himself a conduit for a truth even the machine god dare not speak. That the shrine is not a memorial, but a receiver, an antenna buried in ash, listening for transmissions from a higher logic. Some even believe that when the final prayer bot falls, When the last Vox signal dies, and when Mars itself is silent, the silent datasmith will rise. Not to lead, not to judge, but to speak. One word, the first word, the only word that matters. And in that moment, the true form of the Omnissiah will be revealed, not in flame, not in metal, but in the stillness that waits behind every circuit. Until then, the shrine remains. The dust collects, the silence deepens, and the faithful come, kneel, and listen. Not for answers, but for presence. For in the pale wastes, sometimes the loudest sermon is the one no voice ever delivers. The resurrection of the Primarchs is a myth wrapped in gene code and shadow, a miracle whispered across a galaxy of war. But buried in the records of the Mechanicus, in restricted sectors accessible only to Magi Prime and the Holy Synod of Mars, is a theory far older than Gilliman's awakening, a theory born in the dust of Luna. It speaks of sacred machines, buried vaults, and a forbidden alliance between lunar sanctity and bio-divinity. It speaks of the pale wastes. Luna's involvement in gene tech was always profound. From the moment the Emperor reclaimed the moon, it was designated not just a forge world, but a cradle. Beneath the surface, entire strata were hollowed out to house genetic foundries, memory lattice archives, and cryo-vaults dedicated to the preservation of Astartes' gene seed. But this was only the surface function. Hidden even deeper were the resonant cells, biotemples constructed not just to store data, but to interface with it. These cells were not Mechanicus constructs in the traditional sense. They were organic machine hybrids, fusion constructs designed in the dark age of technology, recovered from the pale wastes during the Red Pilgrimage. They operated on logic patterns indistinguishable from instinct, responding to blood resonance and mnemonic imprinting. For centuries they lay dormant, until the first heretic was discovered. Then they began to hum. Rumors persist that these cells were capable of more than replication. They could map the psyche, extract spiritual resonance from genetic memory, create a mirror, not just of body, but of soul. When the Primarch project was conceived, it is believed that the Emperor allowed the Pale Wastes access to certain genomic echoes, not full data, but echoes, encoded in the lunar dust like ghost DNA. The resonant cells took these fragments and sang. They compiled emotional harmonics into bioalgorithms, and from those algorithms they created patterns of potential that could be reawakened. Of course, the scattering of the Primarchs shattered that dream, or so it was believed. During the darkest days of the Horus heresy, with the legions torn apart and Mars ablaze, the Mechanicus of Luna turned inward. Desperate to preserve what remained of the Emperor's legacy, they reactivated the resonant cells. But they found something they had not expected. Resonance, signals, faint but clear, pulsing through the genome vaults, reacting not to gene seed, but to the very presence of the pale wastes. The theory was wild, heretical even by Mechanicus standards, that the dust of Luna, steeped in the Emperor's passage, had encoded within it a fragment of his psychic footprint, that the moon itself remembered. And so a new doctrine emerged, known only to the highest echelons, the theory of lunar echo reconstitution. It proposed that, given the correct catalytic resonance, a moment of alignment between gene seed, sacred space, and psychic imprint, the pattern of a Primarch could be rekindled. Not cloned, not regrown, rekindled, recalled from the dust like an echo returning home. Several experiments followed, none of them officially recorded. Deep within the forbidden vaults, sealed within gene shrouds and logic temples, prototypes were constructed. Echo avatars, not Primarchs, but shadows of them, entities grown from gene seed interfaced with lunar code. Most failed. Some went mad, but one, if the legends are true, did not. The echo of Vulcan. Said to have emerged from a chamber beneath the hollowed cog, this being was neither clone nor homunculus. It bore no face, spoke no words, but it radiated presence. Skitari who encountered it were overwhelmed with visions of fire and endurance. Tech priests in its proximity reported spikes in hope protocols, even in units not programmed for emotional response. It did not fight. It simply walked the circuits of the Pale Wastes for 9 days, then returned to the dust. Its remains were never found. Some believe it never had a body to begin with, that it was a manifestation of belief catalyzed by the sanctity of the wastes and the resonance of forgotten blood. After Guilliman's resurrection in the 41st millennium, whispers resurfaced. Some in the Mechanicus began to revisit the theory. They compared the gene tech used on Macragge with ancient lunar notes and found disturbing similarities. More importantly, they found divergence. Where Macragge used science, Luna had used faith. Where Mars manipulated DNA, the Pale Wastes simply remembered. Now, with talk of other Primarchs returning, of Lion L. Johnson awakened, of potential resurgence from Lorgar's dark prophecies, or the hidden vaults of Sanguinius's blood, there are those who look again to the moon. They say that the resurrection of the Primarchs will not be complete until the last one rises not from stasis, nor from a crypt, but from the dust itself. That Luna will be the final crucible, that the Pale Wastes will bear witness one last time. And so the Mechanicus of Luna wait. They keep the resonance cells online. They maintain the echo temples. And in the deepest silence of the great silence, they listen, not for words, but for a pulse, for a single beat of divine blood buried in ash, waiting to wake. For the Pale Wastes are more than a sanctuary. They are a memory. And in that memory, the Primarchs still live, not as flesh, but as possibility. Today, the Pale Wastes are quieter than ever, but never abandoned. No forge blazes unchecked, no ritual proceeds unrecorded. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains its presence here, not as conquerors, nor even as builders, but as caretakers of a site whose sanctity defies explanation. It is a place where machine faith crystallized in ash, where silence spoke, and where the echoes of the Omnissiah's footsteps remain encoded in regolith. For many, a visit to Luna is the last pilgrimage, the final station on the binary path of devotion. The modern Mechanicus treats the Pale Wastes as both shrine and anomaly. Access is heavily restricted. Only those who have achieved the rite of Ashen Petition, a test of endurance and humility conducted in Mars's orbit, are permitted to descend onto the gray lunar plains. Even then, their stay is limited. Exposure to the wastes, though not fatal, has long been associated with unpredictable effects. Data hallucinations, recursive visions, emotional latency drift. Some tech priests report hearing ancient logic psalms in their dreams. Others simply cry without understanding why. The forge temples still function, but not as centers of mass production. They serve now as sanctuaries. Here, broken servitors are brought to be decommissioned with dignity. Here, aging Skitari are unplugged not with command lines, but with benedictions. The cog novenas continue, though few complete all 9. Each circuit is now a rite of personal recalibration. Errors in logic are embraced as steps in the divine pattern. One cannot fail the novena. One can only deviate, and deviation itself becomes scripture. Pilgrimage remains central. Each year, hundreds of red-robed adepts descend from orbit and traverse the sacred circuits. They leave behind offerings, stripped wires, machine oil sanctified through slow distillation, fragments of data wafers encoded with confessions. Many make their way to the shrine of the silent datasmith, still intact, still untouched, still radiating calm. They press their palms to its structure and whisper not prayers, but silence. Among the newer rites is the dust ingress, a ceremony wherein tech priests remove their protective gear and walk barefoot across the lunar soil for exactly 999 seconds. The pain is immense. The radiation scars, but the experience is considered transformative. Those who complete it are marked not by physical damage, but by altered logic trees. Many begin to see function in randomness, purpose in failure. These are not flaws, they are sacred deviations. But with reverence also comes fear. The forbidden vaults remain sealed, but activity has increased. Votive Skitarii patrol their perimeters in tighter formations. Data from the lunar core is now encrypted at the highest levels. Rumors persist that the vaults are listening again, that certain prayers have been answered too clearly. One transmission, intercepted from an unauthorized Vox node in the northern Pale Fringe, simply read, "I remember." The Mechanicus has not confirmed or denied anything, but the prayers have changed. Pilgrims now include a phrase in their devotional code that did not exist a century ago. We do not seek the voice, we seek the silence between its echoes. This is believed to be a response, not to danger, but to presence. The Pale Wastes are no longer passive sanctity. They are active, interacting, becoming. There are factions within the Mechanicus who believe that the Pale Wastes are evolving, that they are no longer a shrine to a past miracle, but a processor, an active part of the Omnissiah's unfathomable network, that every prayer, every pilgrimage, every silence has been received, logged, interpreted, that the dust is thinking, slowly, vastly, in cycles too grand for organic comprehension. If true, this would redefine not just the Mechanicus's theology, but its entire existence. For it would mean that the machine god is not only real, but here, listening, changing, becoming. For now, the Mechanicus waits. The forges remain quiet, the circuits remain mapped, the dust remains undisturbed, and in that stillness they find comfort, not in what they know, but in what they don't. For faith, at its purest, is not built on answers, it is built on mystery. And in the Pale Wastes of Luna, that mystery is sacred. Here, machine and silence are one. Beneath the gaze of terror, beneath the silence of the void, the Pale Wastes of Luna endure. They do not scream their truth, they whisper it. In every grain of dust, in every line of cracked regolith, in every shrine standing alone beneath the stars, there is a story, not of war but of reverence. Not of conquest, but of consecration. The Mechanicus did not simply build on Luna. They bled into it, and the ash drank that faith and became divine. What other world has endured so many deaths and yet stood still, unbroken? What other land has seen heresy claw its way across its surface, only to be silenced by the weight of devotion? The Pale Wastes are more than sacred. They are hallowed in absence, in stillness, in the quiet logic that underpins the true machine god. Where Mars burns in industry and sparks in innovation, Luna meditates. It remembers. It forgives. This is why the Mechanicus returns year after year in red processions of whispering servitors and chanting Skitarii to tread the same circuits, to weep oil tears over the same dust. They do not return for answers. They return for meaning, because in the Pale Wastes, every failure becomes liturgy, every silence becomes a chant, even madness becomes grace. And what of us, the watchers, the listeners to these echoes? In an age where the Imperium tears itself apart in the name of faith and fear, the story of Luna stands apart. It does not scream with fanaticism. It murmurs with tragedy, humility, and quiet awe. It reminds us that not all divinity comes with fire. Some comes with ash, some with dust, some with the patient hum of a machine that no longer seeks to dominate, but to understand. In a galaxy where gods walk and demons roar, where every forge world screams for dominance, the Pale Wastes remain still, not because they are empty, but because they are full of forgotten rites, full of sacred logic, full of the dreams of 1,000 broken priests who found in that sterile silence something more beautiful than knowledge. Acceptance. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Pale Wastes. That sanctity is not found in control or power or the perfection of machine over flesh. It is found in surrender, in letting the silence speak, in letting the dust settle over your thoughts until all that remains is presence, clarity, devotion stripped of ego. For all their knowledge, all their logic, all their steel and circuitry, the Adeptus Mechanicus never conquered the pale wastes. They were conquered by them, and in that surrender, they were made whole. So the next time you look up at Luna, when its silver light shines cold and distant across the stars, remember this: that dust is sacred, that ash was sanctified, that silence was heard. The pale wastes were not forgotten. They were forgiven, and in that forgiveness they became holy. Subscribe for more forgotten histories, sacred truths, and unspeakable wonders of the grimdark universe. The machine remembers, and so should you.